The first thing Instructor Verexolen noticed was the smell. Not the smoke from the eastern ridge, though that was still burning on the fourth day. Not the chemical signature of the nutrient packs the cadets had torn open and consumed without heating, which her olfactory sensors flagged as mildly aberrant. It was something underneath both of those things. Something she didn't have a classification for. It took her 17 seconds of processing to identify it as a biological stress marker produced by human sweat glands under conditions of prolonged cortisol elevation. They were afraid. They had been afraid since the second day, which was when the simulation's second weather system had collapsed the northern shelter and 3 of them had spent 14 hours in sub-freezing rain without thermal gear. They were still in the exercise. That was the part Verexolen could not reconcile. The fear response was present, measurable, chemically undeniable. And they were still in the exercise. She pulled up the behavioral prediction matrix she'd built before the cohort arrived and ran the numbers again. The matrix said they should have activated the emergency recall beacon on day 2. She stared at the data. Then she stared at the monitoring feed showing 6 human cadets moving through a forest that her engineering team had specifically designed to be impassable. She had a feeling, unfamiliar and not entirely comfortable, that the matrix was wrong about something important. She just didn't know what yet. The Academy of the Interstellar Defense Compact occupied a station the size of a small moon, orbiting a gas giant in the Cerati system, and it had been producing military officers for 640 years without significant incident. 640 years of cohorts, examinations, field exercises, performance reviews, commission ceremonies. The Compact's 17-member species had cycled through its programs in carefully managed numbers, and the graduation rates had remained, across 6 centuries, within 2 percentage points of the projected models. Humanity had joined the Compact 11 years ago. Humanity's graduation rate in academy programs was 31%. This was, depending on who you asked, either evidence that humans were not suited for interstellar military service, or evidence that the Academy's evaluation frameworks were not designed with human cognitive and physiological profiles in mind, or evidence of something else entirely that no one had quite managed to articulate yet. Verexolen had her own theory. She had been refining it for 3 years, since the first human cohort passed through her advanced survival and coordination program, and she had not shared it with her department head because she could not yet defend it with the kind of precision her department head required. Her theory was not about human weakness. That was what made it difficult to explain. The survival exercise on Carith 7 was a standard component of the ASC program's third-year curriculum. It had been running, in essentially the same form, for 230 years. The planet was not technically a death world. The Compact's classification system reserved that designation for environments with a baseline lethality index above 0.7, and Carith 7 scored a 0.64, but it was consistently, reliably, comprehensively miserable. The engineering team maintained it with care, 3 distinct biomes with independent and occasionally antagonistic weather systems, predator fauna calibrated to create threat pressure without actual risk of mortality, terrain that shifted unpredictably due to subsurface geological activity, and a resource distribution that required cadets to cover significant ground to meet basic survival needs. Standard issue equipment was functional but minimal. Communication with the station was limited to the emergency recall beacon, which cadets could activate at any time to end their participation. Activating the beacon was not automatically a failure. The program's official documentation said this explicitly. The beacon was there. Using it was permitted. Outcomes were evaluated on multiple criteria, not merely duration of participation. In practice, activating the beacon before day 6 of a 10-day exercise had ended the academy careers of every cadet who had ever done it. Non-human cohorts averaged beacon activation at day 7.2 when conditions were standard. Under the enhanced protocols the engineering team had applied this cycle, the collapsing shelter, the modified predator patterns, the deliberate contamination of the primary water source, they had projected beacon activation at day 5.8. The human cohort was on day 4. They had not activated the beacon. They had also not done several other things the behavioral model predicted. They had not divided their attention to individual survival. They had not prioritized resource acquisition over group coordination. They had not, in 14 hours of sub-freezing rain without shelter, exhibited the withdrawal behavior that the physiological stress markers predicted. What they had done was build something. Verexolen had watched the thermal imaging feed and not immediately understood what she was seeing. 6 heat signatures, moving in a pattern that was too organized to be random and too slow to be purposeful transit. It took her 4 minutes to recognize it as a construction process. They were cutting branches in specific lengths and lashing them at specific angles, and 3 of them were working on what eventually became a structure while 2 others maintained a perimeter, and one, Cadet Yusuf Adebayo, who was the cohort's designated logistics officer and who had scored in the 42nd percentile on the Academy's individual resilience assessment, lay on the ground under a thermal sheet and directed the construction verbally. Adebayo had an injury. His left ankle, based on the gait analysis data from the previous 6 hours, had been compromised since the shelter collapse. He couldn't walk without significant pain. He wasn't walking. He was lying on the ground in 14-hour rain coordinating the construction of an emergency shelter with an accuracy that, when Verexolen reviewed the finished structure, she rated as genuinely competent. He had not told the others he was injured. Verexolen ran the behavioral model again. It said that concealing an injury from team members was irrational because it prevented the team from making accurate capability assessments. She thought about that for a moment. Then she thought about why a person might conceal an injury from their team. She thought about the word burden. It didn't have a direct equivalent in her native language. He hid it for 4 days, said her colleague Proctor Essenvale, reviewing the same data across the monitoring station console. His ankle is showing soft tissue damage consistent with a moderate to severe sprain. He has been walking on it for 4 days. He has been coordinating on it, Verexolen said. His transit distance per day is significantly lower than the rest of the cohort. He's redistributing his function, not his participation. Essenvale was quiet for a moment. The model says he should have disclosed. The model says disclosure is the rational choice because it allows the team to optimize resource allocation around a known constraint. Verexolen looked at the feed. But if he discloses, what happens to his position in the team structure? They account for the injury and continue. They account for the injury, Verexolen said carefully, and they begin, at some level they may not consciously recognize, to calculate what they can expect from him going forward. His value to the group shifts. It becomes conditional. She paused. He knows this. Essenvale said, he's hiding the injury to protect his social standing within the group. I think, Verexolen said, and she chose her words with the precision she usually reserved for formal reports, that he is hiding the injury because he has decided that his team should not have to carry the weight of knowing about it. That the knowledge itself is a burden he can absorb that they cannot afford. The silence on the monitoring deck was the kind that meant someone was processing something they weren't sure how to categorize. That's not rational, Essenvale said finally. No, Verexolen agreed. It isn't. She pulled up Adebayo's individual file. His pre-exercise psychological profile noted a high score on the Academy's Group Cohesion Index, which measured an individual's tendency to prioritize collective outcomes over personal ones. It also noted, in the evaluating psychologist's comments, that his score was so far above the standard distribution for his species that the evaluator had briefly considered whether the assessment tool was calibrated correctly for human responses. The evaluator had concluded that the tool was probably fine and the score was an outlier. Verexolen was beginning to think the evaluator had made an error. She was beginning to think Adebayo wasn't an outlier at all. On the monitoring feed, he was pushing himself upright from the ground, bracing against a tree with one hand, and beginning to move toward the river that the engineering team had contaminated. His cohort was already ahead of him. He was moving at approximately 60% of his normal pace, and he was not making a sound. Day 5 arrived with a problem the engineering team had not anticipated, which was the first time in Verexolen's 11 years of running the exercise that the engineering team had produced an unanticipated problem. One of the modified Predator units, a Careth 7 native fauna specimen whose behavioral parameters had been adjusted via neural interface to increase territorial aggression without increasing lethality, had malfunctioned. The neural interface had degraded. The predator was now operating on its own behavioral drivers rather than the modified ones. The Careth 7 apex predator in its unmodified form had a lethality index of 0.3, which technically kept the planet in the non-Deathworld classification but represented a meaningful threat to unarmored cadets without weapon systems. Verexolen's protocol was clear. Malfunction in exercise parameters that created unacceptable risk to participants required immediate intervention. She began preparing the emergency recall broadcast that would end the exercise and extract all cadets simultaneously. Then the monitoring feed updated. The human cohort had found the predator 12 minutes before her team had even flagged the malfunction. She paused the recall preparation and watched. The feed showed all 6 cadets in a position she did not initially understand. They were not retreating, and they were not engaging, and they were not stationary. They were moving in a slow, curved formation that seemed to be neither offensive nor defensive and that was confusing enough that she called Essenvale over to look at it. "What are they doing?" Essenvale said. "I don't know." The predator was tracking them. Its movement pattern was visible through the canopy sensors. It was following the formation's apparent center of mass, which was, Verexolen realized, not where any of the cadets actually were. The formation had a hollow center. The cadets were moving around a point that contained none of them, and the predator was following the point. "They're hurting it," she said. Essenvale said, "Toward what?" "Toward the river." The contaminated river that the engineering team had treated with a chemical compound that was harmless to humanoid biology but intensely aversive to the olfactory receptors of Careth 7 fauna. The cadets had been downstream of that river for 30 hours. They had been unable to use it as a water source, but they had been drinking from it anyway, in small quantities, filtered through improvised materials, accepting the mild gastrointestinal effects that Verexolen had flagged as a physiological cost of their water strategy. They had been drinking mildly contaminated water for 30 hours, and somewhere in that process, one of them had realized that the thing making the water unpleasant for them would be profoundly more unpleasant for the predator. The predator crossed the river bank. Even through the monitoring feed's audio sensors, the reaction was unambiguous. It turned immediately and moved away from the water at speed. The cadets stopped moving. Cadet Adebayo, she noted, had been the center of the formation the entire time. The hollow point, the anchor the predator had been following. He had been standing still in the open because the formation required something stationary at its center for the herding movement to work, and he was the one who couldn't move quickly if something went wrong. He had volunteered for that position. It was on the formation data. He'd reached it first. Verexolen sat down. She had been standing for 6 hours without noticing. She canceled the emergency recall. She opened a new file on her research terminal and started writing notes that she did not have any immediate professional use for. She was writing them because she needed to put the observations somewhere external, somewhere she could look at them, because her internal processing felt insufficient for what she was trying to understand. The note said, "They chose the contaminated water knowing it would make them sick. They treated the consequence as a resource. How long have they been doing this, converting costs into tools? She underlined the last sentence. Then she wrote beneath it, "Does the Academy know they do this? Does anyone know they do this? The exercise was supposed to end on day 10. On day 8, Cadet Lena Vesquez, the cohort's designated tactical officer, who had scored in the 91st percentile on the Academy's individual resilience assessment, which now meant almost nothing to Verexolen in the way it previously had, submitted a formal written request via a method Verexolen had not known was technically available to exercise participants. There was a provision in the Academy's program documentation, buried in an appendix that was reviewed once during orientation and never mentioned again, that allowed active exercise participants to request a formal review of exercise parameters if they believed those parameters contained evaluable flaws. The provision had been written into the documentation 600 years ago as a procedural formality and had never been used. Not once. in 600 years of exercises across 17 species. The request came through on a channel Verexolen's team had to spend 20 minutes finding because none of them had ever seen it activated. It was handwritten. Vasquez had used a marking stylus on a piece of material from her equipment pack to write it, and she had transmitted it using the low-bandwidth telemetry function built into the Cadets' monitoring bracelets, a function designed to transmit biometric data, not text, but which Vasquez had apparently determined could carry a text signal if she reformatted the transmission packet correctly. She had reformatted it correctly. The request said, "We respectfully request that the following parameters be reviewed for the remaining exercise period. 1. The water source contamination compound is degrading more slowly than standard models predict, which means our filtration methods will become insufficient by day 9 and the water situation will be unsolvable rather than difficult. 2. The Eastern Ridge Fire is creating a wind pattern that will push predator fauna into the central biome zone by day 9, creating a density that exceeds what 6 cadets can manage without weapon systems. We are not requesting early termination. We are requesting parameter adjustment or, alternatively, access to the exercise's design documentation so we can adapt our strategy accordingly. If neither is possible, we would like to know what day 9 is actually supposed to test, so we can prepare for it correctly, *. Verexolen read the request 3 times. Then she read it again. "Essenvale," she said. He looked up from his console. "They know," she said. "They have been running projections on the exercise parameters. They understand the engineering." He was quiet. Vasquez figured out the fire was deliberate. Verexolen continued. She figured out the contamination schedule. She's not asking to end the exercise. She's asking for the technical specifications so she can engage with the actual problem instead of the apparent one. "That's not supposed to be possible," Essenvale said. "They don't have access to the engineering data." "They have been inside the exercise for 8 days, Verexolen said. "They have been observing. They have been measuring. They have been treating the environment as a system to be understood, not an obstacle to be endured." She looked at the request again. At the handwritten characters. At the fact that Vasquez had found a way to transmit a text document through a biometric bracelet because the beacon was the wrong tool for the message she needed to send. "She's right about day 9, Verexolen said quietly. "The projections she's describing are accurate. I verified them this morning. The water becomes genuinely unmanageable on day 9. The predator density in the central zone reaches a threshold we would normally flag as unsafe. So day 9 is... Day 9 is a mistake," Verexolen said. "An unintentional compounding of the parameters. We designed each element in isolation. We did not model what they would look like together after 8 days of environmental drift. We have been running an exercise that became, somewhere around day 7, something different from what we designed." The room was very quiet. "And they noticed," Essenvale said. "Before we did." She picked up her communication terminal and began composing a response to Cadet Vasquez. Then she stopped. She set the terminal down. She pulled up the exercise documentation, the full documentation, 700 pages of it, classified at the curriculum development level, and she authorized temporary access for the cohort's monitoring bracelets. She sent that instead. She sent the engineering data. She watched the monitoring feed for the next 4 hours. The cohort gathered around Adebayo, who appeared to serve as some kind of information processing center, and they talked. She couldn't capture the full audio at this distance, but she caught fragments, technical vocabulary, numbers, the word compounding used correctly in a hydrological context, Vasquez's voice saying something about timing, Adebayo's voice saying something she couldn't parse that made the rest of them laugh. They were laughing. On day 8 of an exercise that had exceeded its own design parameters and become genuinely dangerous, sitting around an injured logistics officer who had been walking on a damaged ankle for 6 days, they were laughing. She added a new note to her research file. They are not enduring this. They are, in some sense I cannot fully articulate, enjoying it. Not the suffering. The problem. They are enjoying the problem. She requested a meeting with her department head on day 9 morning, before the cadets completed the exercise, which they did at 1,640 hours on day 10, 6 hours before the official deadline, not because they were exhausted but because they had, based on the engineering data she'd sent them, identified the optimal moment to complete their final objectives and had scheduled accordingly. The department head was an Orvith named Counselor Drethmavis, who had led the Academy's ASC division for 22 years and who had, in that time, developed a considered and evidence-based assessment of every species that had passed through the program. He received Verexolen's request and her preliminary report and called the meeting for the following morning. He read the report twice before she arrived. She could tell by the way he was sitting when she entered, with the particular stillness of someone who had finished processing data and was now trying to figure out what the data meant. "You want to redesign the program?" he said, before she had sat down. "I want the program to be honest about what it's testing," she said. "Currently it tests resistance to adverse conditions. Endurance. The ability to maintain function while suffering. We have been designing increasingly severe versions of those conditions and measuring how long different species can maintain function before the suffering becomes unsustainable. That is the purpose of the exercise. That is what the exercise measures," Verexolen said. "But I don't think it's what we're actually evaluating for. And I think humans have revealed that distinction." Drethmavis waited. "The human cohort did not treat the exercise as a threshold test," she said. "They treated it as an information environment. They extracted data from every adverse condition. They converted costs into capabilities. They modeled the system they were inside and then communicated with me through an unauthorized channel to correct a flaw in the system's design. They didn't endure the exercise. They analyzed it, collaborated on it, adapted it to produce a different outcome than the one we planned." She paused. "And then they asked if there was a harder version." The room was quiet. "They asked," Drethmavis said slowly, "for a harder version." Vasquez submitted a second request on day 9 at 0210 hours. "After reviewing the engineering documentation I sent," she said, Verexolen consulted her notes, because she wanted to be accurate, that the exercise was well designed but that its difficulty was primarily environmental, and that environmental difficulty tested adaptation but not decision-making under genuine uncertainty, and that if the Academy wanted to understand what human cadets were actually capable of, a more useful design would introduce adversarial intelligence rather than adversarial weather. Adversarial intelligence, Drethmavis repeated, an opponent that adapts to their decisions in real time, rather than a static challenging environment. Verexolen looked at him. She was describing a fundamentally different category of exercise. And she was describing it accurately. She's correct that what we run now is an endurance test. She's correct that what she's describing would test something different. She's a third-year cadet asking us to redesign our curriculum. She's a third-year cadet who analyzed our curriculum's design parameters from inside the exercise and identified its conceptual limits. Verexolen paused. "Sir, I have run this exercise for 11 years. I have run it with Miraline cohorts who average day 8 completion. I have run it with Orvith cohorts who average day 9.3. I have run it with every species in the compact. No cohort has ever submitted a formal parameter review request. No cohort has ever transmitted text through a biometric bracelet. No cohort has ever identified an engineering flaw in the scenario's compounding dynamics before the engineering team did." She looked at him steadily. "And no cohort has ever, at any point in 640 years of this program, asked for the harder version." Drethmavis was quiet for a long time. "What are you recommending?" he said finally. "3 things, Verexolen said. First, review the Academy's cognitive and resilience assessment instruments for human-specific calibration. I believe we have been measuring human cadets with tools designed for species with different psychological profiles, and the results have been misleading us about human capability for 11 years. She held up the second point before he could respond. Second, begin development of the adversarial intelligence exercise Vasquez described. Not for humans specifically. For all cohorts. She's right that it tests something our current curriculum doesn't reach. She paused before the third. Third, I want to share the monitoring data from this cohort's exercise with the Academy's research division. All of it. The injury concealment, the predator herding, the water strategy, the parameter analysis. I want someone to study it properly because I am not qualified to study it properly, and I think it is the most significant behavioral data this program has produced in my 11 years of running it. Dreth Mavis looked at her for a long time. The 31% graduation rate, he said, is almost certainly wrong, Verexolen said. Not in the direction you think. Explain. We have been failing human cadets for 11 years on assessments designed for different cognitive and physiological profiles. We have been interpreting their behavior through frameworks built for species that process group dynamics, risk tolerance, pain management, and adaptive decision-making differently. The cadets we've passed have exceeded our instruments. The cadets we've failed may have exceeded our instruments too, and we didn't know it because we were measuring the wrong things. Dreth Mavis was very still. If that's true, he said carefully, then for 11 years. We've been wrong, Verexolen said. About what we were seeing. About what the data meant. About what they are. The silence was the kind that happened when a large thing settled. Get me the research division, Dreth Mavis said. Today. The cohort debriefing happened the afternoon of day 10, after the cadets had been extracted, medically evaluated, fed, and given 4 hours of recovery time. Adebayo's ankle was imaged and found to be consistent with a moderate sprain sustained on day 2. The medical officer asked him, with the professional neutrality common to Academy medical staff, why he had not reported the injury. Adebayo said, "Didn't want to worry anyone." The medical officer noted this in the file and moved on. Verexolen, reading the debrief notes that evening, stopped at that line. Didn't want to worry anyone. Not, I didn't want to be seen as a liability. Not, I calculated that disclosure would reduce my standing. Not any of the self-interested framings that the behavioral model would predict. Didn't want to worry anyone. He had walked on a damaged ankle for 8 days, volunteered for the most exposed position in the predator herding formation, directed construction of an emergency shelter while lying in the rain, and his explanation was that he hadn't wanted to worry anyone. She wrote in her research notes, *, the behavioral model cannot account for this because the behavioral model assumes self-interest as the primary motivating variable. He is not operating from self-interest. He is operating from something else. The model doesn't have a name for it. I'm not sure I do either, *. She wrote, *, they arrived here expecting a test. They found a system. They then spent 10 days becoming experts in the system, adapting to the system, correcting the system's errors, and ultimately asking to help design a better system. They did this while afraid, injured, sick from contaminated water, managing an unplanned predator encounter, and sleeping in rain. They did this because that is apparently what they do when they encounter a problem. *. She looked at that last sentence for a long time. She added, *, the Academy has been trying to break them for 11 years. We have not once stopped to consider what they were building while we were trying. *. Vasquez's second request, the one asking for the harder version, was technically still open in the Academy's formal review queue. Verexolen had not closed it. The queue system would auto-archive it in 30 days if no action was taken. On the 29th day, she formally approved it. Not as a policy change. Not yet. As a research authorization, funding Vasquez's request for an adversarial intelligence exercise design as a collaborative curriculum development project, with Vasquez listed as a contributing designer alongside Verexolen's own team. She sent the authorization to Vasquez's Academy mail address with a single line of text. *, you were right about what we were testing. Let's build the thing that tests the rest. *. Vasquez's response arrived 4 minutes later. It said, *, we've already started. I'll send you what we have, *. There were 47 pages attached. Verexolen opened the first page, and then she sat back, and she looked at the ceiling of her office for a moment. At nothing in particular, at the plain structural material of a ceiling she had looked at for 11 years without much consideration. She thought about 640 years of exercises. She thought about 31%. She thought about a woman who had transmitted a text document through a biometric bracelet because the available tool was wrong and she'd fixed it rather than accepted its limits. She thought about a man who had concealed an injury for 8 days so that his team wouldn't carry the weight of knowing. She thought about what the Academy had assumed it was doing for 11 years, and what it had actually been doing, and the distance between those two things, and the fact that the gap had been invisible until a cohort of humans had walked into an environment designed to break them and had spent 10 days carefully, methodically, without complaint, mapping every inch of what they were inside. The galaxy had been watching species for a long time. It had categories for strength and categories for endurance and categories for intelligence and categories for aggression. It had frameworks for almost everything. It did not have a framework for a species that responded to a system designed to produce suffering by immediately beginning to understand the system, then improve it, then ask if there was a harder version, not because they were fearless, not because they felt no pain, but because somewhere in the architecture of what they were, the suffering and the problem had become the same thing, and the same thing had only one response, which was to keep going until it was solved. Verexolen opened the 47 pages. She began to read. And somewhere in the second page, in the clean, precise language of a third-year cadet who had spent 8 days sick and wet and afraid in an environment built to break her and had used the time to design something better, she found a note in the margin, handwritten, informal, clearly not intended for official review. It said, asterisk, this version is harder. But I think we can do it. We've been practicing, asterisk. No explanation of what they'd been practicing. No need to explain. That was the part that stayed with her. Long after the file was closed, long after the authorization was processed, long after the 47 pages became the foundation of a curriculum that would, in 3 years, be adopted across every species cohort in the Academy, not because humans demanded it, but because once you saw what it tested, you couldn't defend not testing for it. That marginal note was the part that stayed. We've been practicing. As if endurance were not a limit to be approached but a skill to be refined. As if the breaking point were not a wall but a door, and they had simply been learning one exercise at a time, one cost at a time, one suppressed injury and contaminated water source and herded predator at a time, how to open it. As if they had always known the door was there. As if they had been waiting, patiently and without particular hurry, for someone to